Hi everyone, this is part 2 for exam 2 with regards to healthy communication, and obviously it's very important with regards to the teachers, parents, administrators, that everyone's on the same page. And it starts with active listening techniques to be a better communicator. And it's important to make sure that we're teaching young children especially techniques to manage stress, how to handle positive reinforcement, how to handle aversion therapy, and how to handle praise. A lot of young children and adolescents do not handle praise well because it's not something they're accustomed to. So it's important that healthy communication takes place, and a lot of times it's helpful to keep a communication log if people are having trouble with behavior or communication. They can keep a self-inventory, so to speak, to examine why they might be behaving in a certain capacity, either angry or hostile or frustrated, sort of in the same manner in which a nutritionist would do a health diary to notate behaviors and patterns. And sometimes this can be very helpful to teachers and parents, and then the students ultimately, because then they're having a better understanding of themselves and maybe seeing where the patterns lie to help allow them to alleviate their stress and handle their stress better and have better coping skills and better communication skills. And so it's important when communicating that we are consistent with our signals, because most of communication is nonverbal. We have to make sure that our nonverbal cues are matching what's being said. Otherwise, you can send mixed messages. Okay. So a lot of times, teachers and parents, administrators, students especially, have to deal with a number of situations, life circumstances, at a young age or when they're adolescents, whether it's losing a loved one or a friend, God forbid, to suicide. But it is common that a person might go through different stages of emotions. And so it's just important that we pay attention to changes in behavior, changes in clothing attire, changes in grades, and just noticing patterns that might not have a clear reason as to why. And for example, a grieving person might be very angry about their situation, and this is being displayed in the classroom and in their social relationships, whereas prior to that they didn't display any of these types of behaviors. So it's just one example. And so this can happen suddenly. So it's just to be open-minded about the fact that things do happen, and it's important to make sure that you're facilitating this, and if they need help, to make sure you're nurturing them and guiding them in the right direction. Having them talk to a school counselor, for example, would be a good first step. In other situations, we've mentioned briefly prior to this about bullying, which has become something that's been at the forefront for the last 10 years more than previously, as we've talked about. And a lot of times teasing takes place, and teachers cannot always be there to intervene. But the most practical solution for teasing and criticizing is to just try and ignore and engage in positive self-talk. So it's very important that a teacher is told if the behavior continues to not be modified, and you should, try and share with your classes, how you want these kinds of situations handled, so that it doesn't carry over into more kinds of serious consequences like suicide down the road. So we want to make sure, with regards to communication, that the lines are open, because there's a lot of things, especially with adolescents, that we're having to deal with in terms of hormones, sexuality, and things have changed over the last 10, 15 years with regards to that, and with regards to orientation, and people being more open about these types of things. But it's definitely best that if parents want to have these lines of communication open, the studies have shown that the best way to do that is to just be open from an early age. There's a lot of old school mentality when it comes to dating, and people being open about relationships when kids are teenagers. But there are benefits of dating that improve social skills, it strengthens self-esteem, it just helps them to prepare for more important relationships down the road. And it's not necessarily dating that is helps with the satisfaction of a physical need for intimacy. That's not necessarily what is important when these dates might take place at an early age. But improving social skills, strengthening one's self-esteem, and preparing for more important relationships is definitely an important component of dating. And there's scenarios that might transpire, that you didn't plan on. For example, if you were planning on going somewhere with a date and they told you that they were going one place, for example, and you went to another, then it's probably best that you call your parents and ask for a ride home right away, instead of just quote-unquote sticking it out for fear of maybe some type of retribution or embarrassment, or feeling like you're maybe tattletaling. But you don't want to go to a club or a party, for example, if you thought you were going to a movie. That would be something that you should definitely call home about, and put yourself in a more safe environment. As we get into a little bit more complex relationships as teenagers get older, if couples, for example, of children are too busy with their day-to-day activities to spend time together with their families, they're definitely missing out on a lot of psychological components to a family. And with regards to marriage, the following are definitely predictors for a successful marriage: having similar interests, right? Opposites definitely do not attract in most cases. Similar attitudes, their own parents' success of marriage. Probably the one thing that is not a predictor, even though at a younger age people think that might be, is sexual compatibility. And from a very young age, it's definitely important that self-discipline be implemented by parents, because this is something that will carry over into their lives as they continue to get older and have to make a lot of decisions without their parents around. And a lot of times there's complications when children are younger. For example, babies born to teen mothers are at an increased risk of low birth weight and other complications. And the main reason for that is, unhealthy behaviors not practiced by their parents. So this is something that can carry over, and we just want to make sure that we're doing everything within our power to control what we can to pass on those healthy behaviors to children. Otherwise, dysfunctional families, will continue this pattern for future generations. It's also important that parents teach their children respect, that they understand guidelines and boundaries, and children usually internalize the value of their parents. So it's definitely important that the parents lead by example, as cliche as that might sound, because it definitely has a generational effect for their children. Um, Having said that, a lot of times parents can live vicariously through their children, and they can be a little bit too pushy or demanding and expect perfectionism. Um, but perfectionism can be an addictive behavior, and it's important that at a young age that balance is something that is taught, and just having self-discipline, as we mentioned earlier, and good study skills and good coping skills, developing healthy habits with regards to diet and exercise as well. Unfortunately, divorce, which happens in 50% of families with children, and then in step family situations, the divorce rate's even higher, which puts a lot of stress on the children. So it's important that counseling possibly is considered in these types of situations. One of the greatest challenges for children in blended families is adjusting to the new rules. There's just a lot of emotional things to navigate for blended families. So just something to keep in mind as instructors in your classrooms. So again, a lot of things that happen at a very young age can impact the kids as teenagers. And so we just want to make sure that we're helping them to develop a lot of these healthy behaviors, as I mentioned, from a very young age. So this will impact them to give them greater wisdom, to make better decisions, and hopefully the family is more functional. But a family is dysfunctional when members relate in destructive ways, and these destructive behaviors usually are evident with the kids in these classrooms, especially at a younger age. As far as children being sexually active, talking about that again, practicing abstinence as a teenager has shown to strengthen your marriage later. And it is difficult to physically express affection without arousing some sexual feelings. So, this can in turn lead to sexual behaviors at a young age when they're navigating these hormones. The success of marriage has no connection to the length of the relationship before marriage is not true. It usually takes at least a year and a half, if not 2 years, to really gain a good understanding of your partner. And then having some time where you live together is often recommended, depending on your upbringing, your culture, your belief system, just to see how it is that you guys might navigate the different aspects of cohabitating. And if marriage does take place when kids are still teenagers, the rate is 50% higher than the rest of the population. Teenage marriages end in divorce 75% of the time. So it's important to wait for statistical reasons alone. The better that parents have developed intimacy with their children growing up, the more that they will carry that over into their personal relationships. And discipline, as we mentioned earlier, is a component of making sure that good choices are made. And it is not advised to spank. and it is still practiced, but there are more effective methods of discipline. And spanking, again, is not something that is recommended as an effective way to teach self-control. It might, accomplish other things. But as far as self-control goes, there's better methods to help with this area. And there's techniques mentioned in the book that can help give you ideas about how you can handle this situation in your classroom. I know, for example, in my class, I've used code words. I would say shadow, for example, in one instance, if there was something going on with one student that only they knew what I was talking about, and nobody else had any idea, and that was sort of an indicator to, make an adjustment. Other times I would make sure that I only stood in front of the desk of one of my students if they had anxiety or if they had self-control issues, and that was an indicator that I was going to call on them to answer a question, so they had time to prepare, so it wasn't so spontaneous. So there are methods. These are just a couple of examples to help to teach self-control, having them log their behavior through a behavior diary or even a food diary, as we mentioned earlier, can be other methods to help with self-control. One of the most important components at any age in terms of friendships is to have a mutual respect. And when you have that, then you show a concern for the other person and their views and appreciating difference. And because there is such a diverse component to our schools, and depending on what other area you might be dealing with in terms of your populations. So this is just something to keep in mind. This helps with friendships. There's more reciprocity in terms of giving and receiving, and it just makes for a more healthy, less stressful, less dramatic way to spend your time, especially socially. The behavior style that's best for reducing the risk of violence is to be assertive, not to be passive or aggressive or passive-aggressive, but to be assertive. It's important that you're letting people know in a way that's sharing how you feel about a certain situation and communicating, I feel this way, or I'm stressed, or I'm hurt, or I'm frustrated, as opposed to pointing the finger and saying you're being mean, or you're hurting my feelings, or you're being a jerk. Those things can be inflammatory, even with young relationships, and the sooner they learn how to better healthy communicate, this can impact them tremendously by not being passive or aggressive or passive-aggressive in their relationships and friendships. Sometimes things can happen that are outside of your control with regards to stalking or being very cautious on social media and websites, because there can be different things that happen, people trying to trick you into making you think that it's one person that you're talking to, but it's really another. You just have to be very careful with the internet. And if you do find yourself being stalked, you want to ask your friends and family to monitor the stalker's behavior so that you have a witness, that you're documenting this type of thing, to make sure that if anything transpires, that you have proof that it's not your word against theirs, for example. Okay, so make sure that you're documenting all of these things. So again, in summary, you want to make sure that you, as cliche as it may sound, treat others the way that you want to be treated, and do everything in your power to teach children to trust their feelings, trust themselves, and be as healthy at communicating as you can be verbally and non-verbally. And this will carry over into all of their relationships, personal relationships, and their intimate relationships in the future. All right, this concludes Part 2 of Exam 2 Notes on Communication.